there's this unique thing that happens in Mangala. So that I'm going to talk about that. Then we'll talk about the area where we have worked, where this work is, and then we'll talk about, now this is the interesting part where you guys will be driving the observations. I will just be showing you what all we got through the data, and then we'll come up with the conclusions and the recommendations that we gave based on the observations that we had. Okay, so now this is the Mangala field, right? This is a seismic cross section that we have through the field. Now, if you see here, this is a nice tilted fault block structure, right? You have a huge main boundary fault over here to the west over here, and you have the formations dipping downwards from there, right? So it's a simple tilted fault block closure that you have. So all the structure over here, what happens is you have the oil water contact here, and you have the oil column basically trapped between the oil water contact and the fault over here. So it's a simple tilted fault block structure, nothing too complex about that. The reservoir is this particular reservoir. The top red line that you see, that's the Fatehgarh. That's the Fatehgarh formation, and that is the top of the reservoir that you have, and it extends all the way till this pink line that you see over here. That's the base of the Fatehgarh. That's actually the basement, the volcanic basement that we have. Now, on top of that, you have okay, sorry, this is kind of a mistake over here. This is supposed to be source over here. Sorry. So the source over here actually lies on top of our reservoir. So if this red line is the top of the Fatehgarh and this whole section over here is the Fatehgarh, this yellow line over here and the formation here is the Barmer Hill. This is our actual source. So this is kind of like a new thing where the source is actually on top of the reservoir. Generally, in most of the places where you would see the source lies below the reservoir and the oil kind of moves up into the reservoir, right? But here, what has happened actually is the Barmer Hill is lying on top of the Fatehgarh, but as you go deep into the reservoir down here, away from the fault, Barmer Hill over here becomes deep. It produces the oil over there, and then that oil laterally moves into the Fatehgarh and then moves up and gets trapped at the fault over here. So we have sort of like a lateral migration of the oil from Barmer Hill into the lower Fatehgarh, right? Did you kind of get that? Is there any doubt over here? No?
No doubt, sir. Get it.
Okay. Okay. And on top of the Barmer Hill, we have our seal, which is a shale, which is a Dharvi Dungar. That's the name of the shale over there. That's like a regional seal that prevents the oil from moving up and getting lost on the surface. So we have the seal over here. And this over here is the top structure of the Fatehgarh reservoir. So as you can see towards the left, you have this fault. That's the main boundary fault. We call it the MBF, and it's higher at the this is the crest of the field because it's higher than the rest. The red is the highest point, and as you move away from the fault, the structure goes deeper and deeper, and then you hit the oil water contact at this point. Okay. So now I'll have to kind of minimize this. Sorry. Yeah. So now if we look at a well that was drilled in the Fatehgarh reservoir, how does the log signature, how does it look? Now I don't know how the curriculum has changed over the time since I was there, but I do not remember learning about any logs during my time at IIT Bombay. So I'll just give you a brief idea of what the logs are over here. So the first log that you see over here is a gamma ray log. Just a simple question: have you guys like learned about any logs in college?
No, sir. We learn in fourth semester, so
Okay,
we all know
okay,
a
sure.
journal of.
No problem, no problem. So I'll just give you an idea of what these logs are then also as well. Right? So the first log is a gamma ray log. It's a simple log that measures the gamma ray that is being produced by the formation. So now a sand unit will be producing a lot less gamma ray compared to a shale unit. basically you're measuring the potassium, the thorium, and the uranium radioactivity in the formation. So now shales in general have a larger amount of potassium, thorium, and uranium. So they have a larger value of the gamma ray compared to sands. Sands are generally poor in these three elements, so they do not have a higher radioactive output. So if you see, the scale will be going, so this is the zero of the gamma ray and this is around 150 over here. So the ones that are marked in yellow are lower and those are the sands over here. The grays that have been marked are have a higher gamma ray output and those are the shales. Get this is the gamma ray log. Now coming to the next log over here, this is the resistivity log and this is quite simple. It just simply measures the resistivity, and as you guys know, the oil is more resistive compared to water. So wherever you have a high value, now this again goes from 0 to a high value over here about 10,000. So wherever you have a low value over here, that is basically the water that is less resistive, and wherever you have a red, a high value, that is the oil. Okay, so this is a nice oil column over here that we have. This is a nice oil charged sand that we have over here. Again, another oil charged sand that we have over here. So that is basically a simple resistivity log. Okay, we will not get into this log right now, but I'll just give you an idea. That's the density log and a neutron porosity log. Density log, as the name suggests, is simply a measure of the density, and let's not go into the neutron log. So the basic things that you have to look over here are the sands which are marked in the yellow over here, which are the lower gamma ray, and the high oil saturations that you have based on the resistivity log. Okay, is this clear? Is this clear till now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, okay. So now I'll just I'll just show you how the Fatehgarh formation. We have divided it into into five different units. So we have at the top we have a Fatehgarh formation one, so FM1. That's how we have named. That's the nomenclature. So this is the topmost zone of the Fatehgarh over here. It's actually a meandering channel deposit. It's the whole Fatehgarh is a fluvial channel deposit, but the topmost, the Fatehgarh over here, is a meandering channel. I hope you guys know what a meandering channel is, right? So it's got a lot of point bars and channel deposits rather than a simple deposit of sand like you have in braided channels. So this meandering channel, you have thin sand and shale units that are, one after one above one another, that have been stacked one above one another. So you do not have a continuous sand unit. Instead, you have a sand unit, then you have a shale unit, then another sand, then a few more shales, then another sand. So it's like a alternating sequence. Then below that, you have the Fatehgarh formation 2, the zone 2 that you have, that has been divided into two different bits, the FM2A and the FM2B. Now the FM2A is a very thick shale unit that you have, and the FM2B is another meandering channel deposit where you have another sand and shale and a sand alternation unit. Then below that you have FM3, the third unit that you have. And once we go into the FM3, we actually have a change in the depositional environment. Over here from FM3 to FM4 and also FM5, these are actually braided channel deposits. So the sands over here are actually deposited right within the channel in a very nice thick sand braid, a sand big sand unit, right? So as you can see, this is completely sand over here with a very minor thin shale. So this is like a very thick sand. uh, it's like a basically a tank that you have of oil that is right below right below the surface. The same thing happens in FM4 over here, and FM5 actually is a very thin unit, so we kind of ignore that right now. Now, our focus is actually going to lie in this topmost unit, the FM1 over here. So, just if you have any doubts about this, just ask me now only, because we're going to be focusing only on this. This is comprising of nearly 45% of the production that we do in the field. Only because if you have this at the topmost area, because your Fatehgarh is kind of dipping down over here. If you have the Fatehgarh zone 1 also dipping like this, laterally it has the highest, it has the largest extent. If you go down, as you go down in the log, the amount of area that you have available for that zone above the oil water contact is very low. But the FM1 actually has a very large area at the crest above the oil water contact, right? So if you look at it as an aerial extent, the FM1 has a much larger extent compared to the other four units that you have at the bottom, because of the sheer volume that you do not get because the oil water contact comes up now. Is this clear? Is this is slightly confusing? I mean, even experienced professionals sometimes take some time to wrap their head around this. So is this clear? Is this, I can explain it again if it's not clear.
If anyone have doubt, you can ask.
Yeah, like, I mean, don't be shy. I know. Do you guys want me to turn on the video or something? I mean, so that it makes it easier for you guys to think of me as a human being and go like, oh, you know what, this guy is like nice. 1 second, I'll just. Sorry. Yeah. Is there any doubt? Is there any doubt here, guys?
Sir,
Mm-hmm. Sure. Go on.
sir, in the Mangala field, when you were talking about the Fatehgarh formation, sir, I have a question that what may be the lateral dimension of this formation?
So laterally, so the aerial extent of this field is about 12 square kilometers, right? So this thing that you see, this map that you see over here, right? This is actually 12 square kilometers over here, right? Now laterally from the crest till this area, we call this the flank actually, because this is the oil water. This black line that you see over here is the oil water contact. Okay, so from here to here, this would be about you know a kilometer, maybe 2 kilometers in width, and this would be about 6 kilometers to 7 kilometers in length over here. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So if
Yeah.
you if you see if you see the map, if you see the map, right? If you if this is the oil water contact coming over here, right? This one, right? So as you go deeper, the oil water contact is horizontal, right? So any doubt still here? I mean, did you guys get the whole idea of the field, where and how it is, and uh, how we've divided it into sections, into zones, into different parts of the field? Has everyone got that? Any doubts here?
Yes, sir, you can go ahead.
Okay, so now I'll give you a brief idea of what exactly was the problem. Okay, just let me get a pointer here so that, yeah. Okay, so now what was happening was in the Mangala field near the MBF. Now I'll just go back to the map here. So near the map over here, right near the Mangala boundary fault, the main boundary fault over here, the MBF. Here we had a few wells actually that were not giving us the same amount of productivity, the same rates that we expected. So we have a model as well built for the field. It's a simple static and dynamic model where we give a simulation of how we're going to produce it, and that gives us an estimated rate of how it's going to produce, how much are the rates, how much oil is going to come out, what is the water cut that is going to be there, right? So that was not in line with the actual production that we were getting. We are actually getting a very comparatively very low production rates, as well as our injection. So we have injection happening in the field as well, where we inject water from injectors in the field and we produce from producers. So the producers were not giving a good production rate, neither were the injection rates good in the injectors. So now the idea was to understand whether it was anything related to anything related to a geological reason, any geological reason in that area, which would be putting the impact on the performance of the wells. So now the main objective of the study that was defined was to identify how we are going to characterize these underperforming wells and understand and study the geological reasons behind it and find if there was any kind of correlation between the factors and the production or the injection, right? So let's say we found a particular factor that was in that particular area, a geological factor that we thought that we should look at, and we need to see if that is standard across all the bad producers or all the good producers. For example, let's say we are talking about we took the geological element. The first geological element that we took was sand. How much of sand is there in the well, right? If you have a very high amount of sand in the particular well, how is that correlating with a good producer? If you have less amount of sands in that particular well, is that correlating with a bad producer? So that is just an example that I'm giving. So we are just going to look at different elements, different kind of factors, and try to correlate them with the bad producers and the good producers. Okay, so that was the idea that we had over here, that we identify the parameters that we can use to characterize these underperforming wells, and then look into each factor and see if we can correlate them based on the good or the bad producers. Okay, is this cool now, guys?
Yes, sir.
Sir,
Okay. Now,
what do you mean by
now
Yes,
coming
sir.
now coming
sir?
to a major unique characteristic of the Mangla field over here, we have something called sorry, gravity collapse faults in this case. So I'll just start off with the basic geological concept that we have of gravity slumping. Okay, so now gravity slumping here, I'll just show you this video. It'll take some time to load actually. Okay, oh, it's loaded. That's great. So just have a look at this video. Okay, it kind of explains everything that I want to explain, right? What is happening here is there is a failure at this slope. It's a gravity instability, a simple gravity instability, and that is causing the debris to actually fall down the slope in a concave form, in a concave form over there. If you see, the formation in the individual blocks has remained unchanged. It's just basically slid down and rotated, right? Are you guys able to see the video?
Yes, sir. We can see.
So is there
Yes.
any doubt over here? So it's a simple gravity instability because of the gravity overcoming the friction. The whole formation has just slid down and it has resulted in a listric, in a scoop fault kind of structure. Okay, so this thing is happening at the crest of the Mangla field. As I mentioned, the crest is the part of the field at right at the top of the field near the Mangla bounding fault. Now, if you see this structure over here, this fault over here, this is actually that surface that I was talking about, that scoop structure, that scoop fault. So over across this fault surface, across this surface, what has happened is this Fatehgarh formation, it if this was not there, it would have simply gone up and it would have terminated across at the bounding fault over here. But because of this scoop fault over here, this formation, it rises up and then it actually goes down. It has slid down over here. So if you see, the blue over here is actually the lowest point. It's rising steadily and continuously all the way till the highest point over here, and then as you can see, it's actually gone down again, right? Is this clear? Is this image clear to everyone?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so what is happening is this.
Sir, can you repeat that image?
Okay, simple. So actually, if we go to this schematic, right, it would be easier to understand. So what is happening is this is the Mangala bounding fault over here, the MBF over here. Okay. Now, sorry. Is someone asking something? It can, if there's no one asking anything, can they mute the uh, mic as well, please? Thank you. Right. So if this is the bounding fault, this is the MBF over here on the left. Now you have the Fatehgarh, the top of the Fatehgarh coming from the bottom over here, and it's rising up all the way. And if this fault was not there, if this scoop fault was not there, what would have happened is it would have simply gone all the way up and it would have hit the MBF over here, right? So this is how the formation would have been if this scoop fault was not there. But since this scoop fault is there, there was a gravity instability over here. What has happened is this formation has actually slid down over here. Like how we were seeing in the video, across this fault, it has simply just rotated down. Is this clear now?
Yes, clear.
Okay. So now this image is this is a 2D, this is a cross section, this is a 3D image that you're looking at, right? If you cut a cross section at this point over here, this is what you're going to see. Okay. So across this scoop fault over here, you have the Fatehgarh formation coming up and then actually going down, sliding down, and then continuing a little ahead, right? So this is what is happening. So what we encounter here is if we have three wells going through this Fatehgarh formation, if we have a well looking at well number 3 over here, this well encounters the complete FM1 section over here, right? There is no fault, there is no kind of disturbance at all over here, and you have the complete FM1. So the log that we were seeing in this particular slide, this one. So this complete section is available for well number 3. Okay, over here. This well number 3, the whole of Fatehgarh is completely available for this well. Now, if we go to well number 2 over here, what is happening is because of this fault, we do not have the complete section at this point. We have some part of FM1 that has actually been eroded away, that has actually moved away from here. So we do not get the complete section of Fatehgarh over here. And if we move to well number 1, over here what we have is we do encounter the top of FM1 in this case, but the in the middle it's not the complete thickness of FM1. In the middle we see a few missing sand units. So over here in well number 3 we have the complete unit. In well number 2 the top of the Fatehgarh is gone, and in well number 1 in the middle you have some sand units that are missing over here. Okay, is this clear to everyone?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now
Yes, sir.
if we go to another case over here, in this case we have two faults, two scoop faults, one after another, right? So you have one fault and on top of that another fault. So over there, the missing section, the amount of Fatehgarh that is kind of eroded away is a lot larger than when it was a single fault. Okay, so you have areas where there's a single gravity collapse fault or a scoop fault, or areas where you have multiple scoop faults at the same area. Okay, so this is a very important concept that is there. You need to keep this in mind as we move ahead. So now the idea was that this at the crest, wells at the crest that have been drilled over here, like well number 1, well number 2, and even well number 3, what was happening was that we were not able to produce as we expected, right? So now we had to kind of study the data that we had, look at the wells that we have in the field, and then come up with a plan on how to identify, how to basically delineate, how to understand what was going wrong in these wells. So now what we are doing was we were looking at, we have around 400 wells in this field. Now we had to kind of cut down the number of wells because we cannot really look at all the wells over here. So we have to cut down on the number of wells and we have to find out how we have to do that. How we're going to reduce the number of wells, what is the logical reasoning that we're going to use over there. So now the first thing that we used to cut down the number of wells was all the wells that were passing through any of these gravity collapse faults. All of these wells that were encountering these faults over here, like the well number one, well number two over here. Here in this case, you have well number three and well number four as well, right? So all these wells, these were the first wells that we considered for further studying. After that, what was the other wells that we started looking at were the wells that were very close to this fault. Now, why did we do that? Because if we have a huge fault over here, now this fault has a throw of nearly 1 to 2 kilometers. That's a very big fault. Now we expect some kind of issues, some kind of geological changes in terms of the reservoir, in the reservoir properties near this huge fault. So now those were the wells that we also considered. So based on that, we had 44 wells. So from the earlier 400 wells, we could narrow down ourselves to 44 wells over here. Just simply based on the fact that they were passing through a gravity collapse fault, or they were, very close to the main bounding fault. Now, this is the distances that you have across these wells. So as you can see, most of the wells over here are lying, this is a 300 level mark. So apart from about 6 or 7 wells, out of these 44 wells, almost all the wells here are lying in within 300 meters of the MBF. Now that's a big area that we're looking at. That was sort of considered to be the extent of the changes that would happen because of the MBF. A few wells that we considered beyond 300 meters were simply considered to see how far the extent of this MBF would go. How far would it extend away from the MBF, and how many wells do we have to look at, right? Is this clear? Is this fine? Is there any doubt till now?
No, sir.
No? Okay. So now that we have the
Sorry,
well, sure, good.
man, I'm not able to understand how you jot down from 400 wells to 44 wells right from
Okay.
this distance from MBA data.
Right, right. Okay. So firstly, you got this bit, right? The gravity collapse
Yes,
fault
sir.
that we have over here, you got this bit, right?
Yes.
So now what we did was, let's take this case one over here, right? There are wells that are going to be like well number three, where we have the complete section of FM1 available to us, right? Hello?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So these wells were simply removed from the study, because if we have the complete FM1 section over here, there is no problem in terms of the reservoir properties, in terms of geology in this well, is there? Right. So out of the 400 wells that we started off, any of these wells that had the complete section like this well number three, we could simply discard those wells, because there was nothing abnormal, there was nothing out of the normal from the regular wells over there. Now, if we look at well number two and well number one, what is happening here is you are encountering the scoop fault, right? You are encountering this scoop fault, you are seeing this in the log. What is happening is the Fatehgarh is getting cut over here, right? You're not encountering the complete section of the Fatehgarh over here. So we we considered these wells only in the study then. So if we look at all the wells, the whole distribution of the wells, so the wells are all over this field over here, in this field over here, right? Now what we did was, only towards the crest, what we had was the scoop fault, and we saw which of the wells which are actually encountering these scoop faults in the log, which of the wells are actually going through these scoop faults, and those are the wells that we considered. Does that answer your question? So
Yes, yes.
from 400 wells, these were the only wells that are actually having a situation like this. Okay. Now, as an additional barrier, as an additional proof of which wells we should take, we also considered wells which were within the 300 meters of the MBF. Okay, just simply so that we do not disregard any wells which are facing issues based on geological properties. But if we simply use the passing through the gravity collapse faults argument, a lot of the wells would not be considered in the study. So to have some wells which are also, in that area but not passing through the gravity collapse faults, we considered this additional criteria of 300 meters. So a few more wells were added. So if we simply consider the wells that pass through the gravity collapse fault, they were about 30 odd wells, 30-35 odd wells. But those were very few number of wells that we can use to have a study. There needs to be some minimum number of wells after based on which you can draw some conclusions. If we have only 25-30 wells, we cannot really draw a proper conclusion, because that's not enough data. So to include a little more data points, what we did was we added another criteria that if there's a well lying within 300 meters of the MBF, we will also consider that, even if it does not pass through a gravity collapse fault. Is that clear?
I want to ask one thing. What is the cost of each well, approximate cost, and what is the maximum number of wells that a geologist can dig?
Cost in terms of drilling, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, drilling.
So it depends actually. Now this Mangla is actually a developed field, right? It's a completely it's way into the development stage. So there are different stages to a field. You have the exploration phase, then you have the appraisal phase where you basically find out how much amount of oil is there in the field, how you can produce it. That's the appraisal phase. And then there comes the development phase where you're actually producing from the field. So Mangala is in the development phase. So if you are in the exploration phase, the cost of the well is a lot higher because you have no idea about the field. You're basically going in blind. You have no idea about the reservoir. You have no idea about the pressures that are going to be there. So there's a lot more safety precautions that you take. So the cost of the well increases in the exploration phase, and in the development phase, since you have a lot of idea about the oil, the reservoir, the pressures in the field, the cost of the well comes down, but it comes down to about $1 million. That's on an average. Now if you have large contract with a services company, then the cost of the well, because of the number of wells that you're drilling, it's sort of like, if you buy in wholesale, your rates are lower, but if you buy a single uh, thing, your rates are higher, right? So if you have a large contract, your cost of wells is lower, but on an average, if you are going to drill a single well in a development field, it's on an average about $1 million. Okay, so that, I guess, answers the first part of your question. The second part, where you asked how many wells you can drill, that is actually not in the hands of the geologists. That is actually in the hands of the production team, the production engineers, the reservoir engineers that you have, because depending on the reservoir, on the style, on the type of the reservoir, on the support that you get from the aquifer, the properties of the reservoir, all of those things define how you're going to produce the field, right? Depending on how you're going to produce the field, the number of wells changes from that. So now the question of how you're going to produce the field is not in the hands of the geologist. It's in the hands of the production engineers, the reservoir engineers. So they decide how many wells are going to be drilled in a particular field, and the geologists simply help them drill the wells. So we have a say in the number of wells, but it's not just our decision. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. It does.
So
Okay.
I have a small weird
Yeah.
question. So correct me if I am wrong. Can you please go back to the that slumping slide? Yes,
Which one?
sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. So can we can observe in this case that there is a gradual gravity collapse faults. So it can be weird, but can't we do the that multi-well hydraulic fracturing at an angle so that whole problem can be solved easily?
Okay. Firstly, hydraulic fracturing is not really a very easy thing that we can do in this case, because you have this particular fault over here, this bounding fault that you have over here. This is a highly susceptible fault in terms of tectonic activity. So if you induce further pressure in this area, further hydraulic fracturing involves a lot of pressure, right? It's
Yes.
injecting water at a very high pressure. So there is a chance that you might simply reactivate this fault,
Okay.
right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
that is a big risk that you're taking. And this is not in some isolated area where there's no habitation, there's no human settlements around. It's near Barmer. Barmer is a big city in Rajasthan. You can't simply activate a big fault in Rajasthan, right?
Yes.
that
Definitely.
that will cost the company millions billions of dollars if that happens. So it's not a very easy thing that you can simply just go and do a hydraulic fracturing and it just solves the problem, right? So it's not so easy in that case. It was considered, it has been discussed. We'll discuss that in the later slides. That does come up. Okay.
Okay, sir.
Okay, sure. So everyone is clear about the location of the wells that we have in in the study that we used in the study.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So now that we have the wells, now that we have the location of the wells, we had to sort of distinguish between the good producers and the bad producers, right? We had to put in some criteria to distinguish between, okay, this well is producing at a good amount, this well is a bad producer or a bad injector, either way, right? So we had to do that. So now what did we do? We looked at production data. What we did was we simply took the number of days the well was online for, and we added the amount of oil, the cumulative oil that it had produced over the period of time it was producing, right? And based on that, we came up with a metric. We came up with an average rate above which the well would be classified as a good producer, and below which we would call it a bad producer, right? So if we take the total amount of oil that it has produced in 1,000 barrels, so this MBBL is 1,000 barrels, and keep it divided by the number of days that it was online for in terms of months, that is the rate that we have for the well for its history. So now, based on the performance of the other wells in the field, on an average a good performing well was giving about 20,000 barrels per month, and the best performer in the field was going up to 64,000 barrels a month. Now, based on this became our threshold. 20,000 barrels, anything above that would be classified as a good well, anything below that would be classified as a bad well. So, based on the production over here, this graph that you see, anything that has produced below 20,000 barrels has been classified as a bad well, and that is shown on the map over here. That is the distribution. So, the red dots that you see over here are the bad wells, and the size of the pie of the circle over here shows the amount that it has produced. So the red ones are the smaller circles over here. As you can see, the green ones are the larger ones. They have produced at a better rate. They have produced a lot more over the same number of days that the bad producers were online for. Similarly, we did the same thing for injectors. What we did was we took the injection rate instead of the production rate. Here the threshold was slightly different. Here the threshold was about 80,000 barrels injected per month. Similarly, we kind of classified them based on the injection rate. So, and this is the distribution of the injectors. Okay, so simply what we did was we took the cumulative oil or the cumulative water injected into the formation, and we divided by the number of days the well was online for, and we got a production rate for that well. And that rate was used to classify the wells into good producers or bad producers. Is this clear, guys?
Yes, sir, you can go ahead.
Okay. So now, out of out of the initial 44 wells, so the 44 wells that we decided that we are going to look at in the study, based on whether they were passing through the gravity collapse faults or whether they lie within the 300 meters of the Mangla of the MBF, the initial 44 wells that we classified based on that, out of that 22 wells based on their production rate had some or the other issue with their injectivity or their productivity. So these red dots that you see on the map, the red points that you see on the map, are the wells, the distribution of the wells that are bad producers or bad injectors. The other 22 wells, the green ones that you see over here, and the yellow ones. The yellow ones are actually average, they're right on the threshold, so we cannot really classify them as good or bad. But I'm still including them in the better producers. So those were the remaining 22 wells that you had over here. Okay, so this is the distribution of the wells, the 44 wells that you have, the 22 bad producers or injectors, and the other 22 good producers or injectors, right? So this is the distribution. Now, this is the basis of the study. This is the fundamental objective of the study. We have defined the wells that are bad, defined the wells that are good. Now we need to come up with what possibly went wrong in this area, in these particular wells rather, that we had issues in productivity or injectivity. Okay, now I've given you the basics. I've given you what has happened in this well. I've given you that there are gravity collapse faults. I've told you that there's a huge fault at that in that area. I have given you the basic idea. Now, what would be the first thing that you would look at? If given this background, what would you be looking at as the first thing? Now this is the part where you give me an idea, you give me something that you would look at, something that you would want to check and then maybe correlate that, okay, this is happening in the bad wells, is this also happening in the good wells, and then come up with an answer. So here, what would be the first thing that you looked at? Keep in mind that there's other data that is available. You have the drilling data, you have the core data, core photographs that you have. All of those data points are still there. The log data that you have from the wells, all of those things are there. So what would be the first thing that you would look at if you had to come up with an answer?
Analyze each of the wells, the positions, where are the good wells, where are the bad wells. Then look at the well logs,
Right.
understand where.
Okay, so we'll go at it at one thing at a time. So the first thing that you mentioned, right, the position of these wells, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so that's the first thing. So we just go one by one. We'll not give all
Okay.
the answers together, right? So that is actually the first thing that we looked at, the position of the wells, right? How far away from the MBF are these wells, right? Because there's this huge fault that is there on the left, right? You have this nearly 2 kilometer fault, 2 kilometer of throw that you are observing across. So over here, there's a huge amount of tectonic deformation, tectonic activity that has happened. So we simply looked at the distance that was there from that particular fault. So the closer it is to that fault, right, the closer it is to the MBF, we are expected to have multiple synthetic, antithetic faults over there. We are expected to have a lot more tectonic deformation across that area. So the closer we are, the more cataclysmic deformation, subseismic faults that we expect. So if we just simply plot the distance of the wells with respect to the MBF, so what we observe is, if there is a well within 100 meters of the MBF, it will be a poor performer. There is no doubt about it. So if you see, this is the 100-meter line over here. Any well that is within 100 meters is a bad performer. So this is a 100 sub 100 meter. This one, the third well, fourth well, fifth, and the sixth well. These six wells are within 100 meters. So we simply just looked at whether they are good performers or bad performers based on their distance. And if it is within 100 meters, it is a bad performer. There is invariably it is a bad performer. Beyond 100 meters, there was actually a big mix. Beyond 100 meters, we had bad wells. Beyond 100 meters, we had good wells, we had average wells, all kind of mixes. So what was the basic conclusion from this was that within 100 meters, there is no doubt that the well would be bad because of cataclysmic deformation, subseismic faults along the MBF. But beyond 100 meters, the performance of the well does not depend on the distance, but it also depends on other factors, that how much net sand that we had, whether it was encountering any scoop fault, or whether it was having any kind of missing section in the FM1 because of these scoop faults. Okay, so as you said rightly, very correctly, we simply looked at the position of the wells, how far away from the MBF, and we came to a conclusion that the closer the well it is to the MBF, the worse the performance. Okay, so that was actually the simplest thing that we could have looked at, and that was actually the first correct answer. So that's done. What is the next thing that you would look at? Right?
The next is well log, I guess.
Yes. So what would you look for in a log? There is a very specific thing that I would want you to look at.
Yeah, the position of the oil fields.
Sorry. Right.
The position of the oil fields in the well log, we will go for the red zone areas
Mm-hmm.
wherever we will find that oil charged sand, and then we can actually correlate and understand the position of the fault from that from the well logs even.
Right. Right. Okay. Okay. So I'll just give a better word for this.
So
So if
can we
yeah.
look for porosity and permeability of that? Like there are sandstones, and so in that log data, can we look that
Yeah,
and
yeah,
enable
that's
to?
another thing. That's another thing. Okay, so we got two answers over here. We got two answers. We'll look at them one by one. So the first thing that we look at is the basic logs, right? If you have a log section, you can simply try and correlate the sand units as you said. We can, based on that, we can determine how much of the sand is actually missing from a well that encounters a scoop fault, right? So if I can just go back to this particular slide over here, if we correlate well number 3 and if we correlate well number 2 over here, what we would observe is that the top sand over here in FM3, that in well number 3 that we see, will be missing from well number 2, right? So this is termed as a missing section. I'm hoping that you guys have learned about this in structural geology, right? If you have a normal fault, you have a missing section, and if you have a reverse fault, you have a repeated section, right?
Yes.
Right. So this is a classic normal fault. Your hanging wall has gone down, so this is a normal fault. So you would expect to have a missing section in this case, right?
Yes, sir.
Yes, so that is actually the next thing that we looked at. So after looking at the MBF, after looking at the distance from the MBF, what we saw was, sorry, oh, my bad, way ahead. Right? After looking at the distance from the MBF, what we looked at was the missing section due to the gravity collapse faults. Right? If you look at the two wells that I've shown here at the on the right, you can see that this is the top of the Fatehgarh and this is the bottom of the Fatehgarh over here. In this well, this is over here, and in this well, it is down here. So this well has encountered a lot more sand units compared to this well. Are you getting these logs? Are you understanding these logs? So this is the gamma ray log and this is the resistivity log, right? So these yellow ones are the sands, and these gray ones, these bluish gray ones, are the shales. So here, if you see, there is one, there's this second, there's this third, There are nearly 3 big sand units here. Here we do not get the same number of sand units, right? So what is happening is, because of these scoop faults, we're having missing sections in the wells. So this well is actually like that well number 3, which encounters the complete FM1 section. This well is actually like the well number 2 and the well number 1, where there is some amount of missing section. So we do not have the complete sand that we can basically encounter in FM1. If we try and correlate, this is the this is equivalent, nearly equivalent to this sand. This is the top of this sand over here, and then we do not have anything else. We have another sand over here, but we do not have anything else over here. So this is a missing section. Now we can compute the amount of missing section that we have in the well. So we expect this FM2, FM1 bottom to be somewhere over here, right? If we if we calculate the distance between these two, this comes out to be the missing section. This gives us the missing section in that particular well. So now what we did was, we plotted that missing section, the amount of missing section in the well, against the wells, with how they're performing and how, whether they're good performers or bad performers. So if we observe here, any well which has a thickness of missing section above 15 meters is a bad well, is a bad performer. I mean, there is ample proof here. If you see, look at this well. This has a missing section of about 30 meters. It's a bad performer. This one is again 30 meters. This has nearly 45 meters, 50 meters of missing section. They are all bad performers. But if you look at the wells which have less than 10 meters, 15 meters of missing section, they are all good performers. These wells over here at the bottom over here, they are all good performers, but they do not have any kind of missing section. They have the complete FM1 section over here, right? So the conclusion that we derive from this is that if you do not have the complete FM1 section over here, we are not able to access the complete reservoir, and they are not getting the same kind of support that we expect in these wells. In this well, all of these sands are producing, all of these sands are getting the support from the injector, from the other wells around, but this well is not getting the same kind of support. We're not accessing all the sands that are available to us. We're not able to produce to the limit that we could if we had all the sands available. So that is the major factor that we have over here, because the larger the amount that is missing, the worse the performer is. Like this particular well, it has nearly 55 meters missing over here. This is actually one of the worst performers in the field. Is this clear?
Yes, sir, it's clear.
Yes, sir, clear.
Yeah. Now, if we look at the graph, there are a few wells though that have a large missing section, right? These 3 wells that I have pointed with the arrows here, these wells have large missing sections, but they are producing very well. So there must be something that, I mean, everything will not fit in completely as we want it, right? There will be some exceptions. So we need to find out why these exceptions were. So we looked at only these 3 wells which had large missing sections, but they were producing well. So what happened here in this case was, so I am looking at actually this well over here, this one. Okay, so this well, it has a missing section of about 25 meters, which is this well over here, and we have another well next to it, which is accessing the complete reservoir over here. So if you see this well number Y, well Y over here, this is accessing the complete reservoir over here, and well number X over here is not accessing the complete reservoir because it is encountering a scoop fault. But what is happening here is that the scoop fault is actually at the top of the FM1 reservoir. So in this case, the connectivity of the reservoir is still maintained, right? If you notice, all the yellows over here are the sands. So this sand is still connected to the larger sand, and it is connected to the rest of the reservoir. this sand is again connected to the rest of the reservoir. So in that case, what is happening is if there is support coming from this particular sand, it is still reaching well number X. It is not completely isolated. In if the scoop fault was actually at the bottom of the Fatehgarh zone 1 over here, what would happen is that it would be isolated. But since the reservoir, the fault is at the top of the reservoir, it is not getting isolated. And even though we have less sands encountered here and there is a missing section, we have connectivity with the reservoir and the production of this well is still up to mark. It is not bad. Is this clear?
Yes, sir.
Right? There's no doubt here, right? So if there is a large missing section, we are seeing that the performance is affected. But if the missing section is at the top of the Fatehgarh reservoir over here, the well is still connected to the rest of the reservoir and it still produces at a good rate, right? So these are the three exceptions that we have in this particular missing section context over here, that even though the missing section is high, we still have the production rates which are good because the scoop fault is at the top of the reservoir and it still does not isolate the well from the rest of the reservoir. Okay, if the scoop fault is at the bottom of the reservoir, which is in the case of these other wells, the well becomes isolated from the rest of the reservoir and the support is not the same, the number of sands that we encounter is not the same, and that results in the poor performances. Okay, so now if we go,
Excuse me, sir.
yeah.
So, what is the role of sand here to give performance good and bad? Bad?
So we will be producing from the sands, right? We will not be producing from the shales, right? The sands are actually the ones with the larger porosity, the larger oil saturation, the better permeability, all of those properties that we look for in a good reservoir, for which we need a good property to produce, right? We need a good flow, a good oil saturation for it to be producing that much, right? So that is only available in the sand. In this case, if you look at the shales over here, the saturation is low, the porosity of the shales here is very low. The permeability is extremely low. So we do not produce from the shales. We only produce from the sands. So if the sand is missing from the well, what do we produce from, right?
Yeah,
Yeah. Does that answer it?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So that was the second thing that we looked at. Simply correlating the logs, seeing where all the sands are missing, and based on that you have a missing section defined in the well, and based on that we can correlate if that is happening across all the bad producers, and that is what we see over here. So the larger the missing section, the worse the performance, right? We have a few exceptions, but as I mentioned, the scoop fault, the gravity fault is at the top of the Fatehgarh, so that is not isolating the well from the rest of the reservoir. So that those are the exceptions that we have, and those are only a few of them. Those are only 3 wells. Okay, so the second answer that we got over here was to actually look at the permeability and the porosity of the wells in the crest, right? I think that was the second answer that we got over here. First was actually looking at the correlation of the wells, the correlation of the sands and the logs, and the second was to actually look at the logs as in terms of their properties, in terms of their porosity, permeability, and that is the third thing that we looked at, right? Basically, what we looked at in this case are 3-4 different data points. We looked at cutting descriptions. So cutting descriptions are actually descriptions of the material that comes back to the surface when you are drilling the well. So when you drill the well, because you are cutting through the surface, you need to have that material coming back on the surface, right? Uh, uh, is this clear? Are you getting what are cuttings? You know what are cuttings, right? No?
No, sir. Please explain.
Okay. So if you're cutting it, just forget that we're drilling a well. If you're just drilling a hole into a wall, don't you have debris falling away out of the hole that you drill in the wall? Right?
Yes, sir.
Right? So simply imagine that you're drilling a hole into the ground, right? If forget anything, if you just scoop out anything, you're going to have that material, right? If you have seen any kind of construction anywhere, when you drill the foundation, you have a lot of soil, you have a lot of material, a lot of rock that comes out of the surface, right?
Yes, sir.
So simply, if you drill a hole into the ground, there whatever you're drilling, that needs to come back at the surface when you're drilling a well. That is termed as cuttings. That is actually the rock that you're cutting through when you're drilling the well, that comes back on the surface. Right? Is this clear?
Yes, sir.
As
Kind of.
you drill through the formation, the things the rock that you're drilling through, because you're actually trying to go deeper, you bring that debris back onto the surface, right? You cannot keep it in the well, because you need to have more pipes, you need to have the drilling equipment going into the hole. So you cannot have that material, you cannot have that debris staying in the hole, right? You need to bring it back up so that that hole is clear, it is open, right? So that
Yes.
debris that comes out is termed as cuttings. Now we can look at those cuttings. We can look at those material that has come back to the surface from the hole below, and you can look at it in terms in under the microscope. You can look at the cementation. You can look at the clay content in that. You can look at the porosity. You can look at the grain sizes, the sorting, all of those things. You can look at it and you can come to a conclusion whether it has a good porosity, it has a bad porosity, the cement is good, the cementation has plugged the pores or not. You can look at those things in a cutting, right? So that is one thing that we looked at. Another thing that we have is the core data. So when you're drilling, you do not simply drill through all the wells and you just look at the cuttings. You also take out a core from the well. You actually take it back up to the surface as it is, very intact, completely, so that you can study the formation as they were below the ground surface. So that is another thing that you can have, that you can look at, the core that you can take from the well while you're drilling it. Another thing that you can actually look at while drilling is the mud losses. So, anyone has any idea of what a drilling mud is?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Can you just explain? What do you think it is?
Sir, drilling fluids is basically fluid which we inject while drilling to prevent formation loss and to clean the borewell and to stabilize, also to stabilize the pressure within the
Exactly.
borewell.
That's actually correct. So it's actually a very heavy liquid. It's a very heavy slurry that we make that has two major functions. The first function is actually, as I described, to get the debris that is there in the well, to take it out. So what we do is we inject it through the drilling bit, we inject it through the pipes, and that actually gets circulated back onto the surface, and it takes all the rock material in the hole, it takes it out, it brings it back to the surface. That is the first function. The second function is actually, as we mentioned, is to stabilize the well, because we are drilling through a formation which is very highly pressured. If we drill through a well, if we drill through that high pressure zone and we do not have anything to stabilize it, what is going to happen is all the fluid from the formation is going to come into the well and basically shoot up and make a whole, it's a disaster then. I'm assuming you must have heard of the OIL well issue that happened in Assam recently, where there was a lot of gas outflow and there was a
Yes,
lot
sir.
of fire. So that is basically what happened. The control of the well was lost, right? So there was not enough pressure to prevent the fluid from coming back out. So what the main another main function of this mud is to actually stabilize the well, to prevent anything from coming out of the well before we are ready to produce. Okay, so what happens is if there is a complete pressure equilibrium, that the pressure of the formation and the pressure of the mud that you have in the well is equal, there is not going to be any outflow through the well, neither is there going to be any flow into the formation. So if the pressure is equilibrated, there is no change in the pressure, the mud level is going to remain constant. It's not going to change. But if let's say the formation pressure is higher than your mud pressure, it is going to shoot up. The formation pressure is going to overcome the mud pressure and it is going to come out of the well at a very high pressure. On the other hand, if the mud pressure is higher than the formation pressure, what you're going to do is you're going to lose the mud into the formation. You're actually going to inject into the formation because the pressure of the mud is higher than the formation pressure. So what happens in some cases is, because of the presence of faults, because of the presence of other things like that, you have easy flow channels that are formed in the surface, in the formation below the surface. So what happens is you have the mud that keeps getting, you keep losing the mud into these high flow channels, into these formations, and that is termed as a mud loss. Okay, so you're basically trying to stabilize the well, but the level of the mud keeps going down and down and down because you're losing it through the fault, you're losing it through these formations, you're losing it, right? Because the pressure is not equilibrated. So that is another thing that you can look at. That is, if you have any kind of fault, any kind of flow channel developed, while drilling, you'll have a lot of these mud losses. You'll have a lot of the mud that is going into the formation, and you'll have to keep replenishing. You'll have to keep adding to the mud to maintain the level of the mud in the well. Okay, so these are the few data points that we looked at: the cutting descriptions, the core data points. We looked at the mud losses during the drilling to basically have any idea of if there is any kind of cataclastic deformation near the crest. Now, what do you mean by cataclastic deformation? Is that during, like, you have tectonic activity, right, along the fault, along this large fault that you call the MBF over here, you'll have a lot of grain rearrangement. You'll have grains that break because of the intense pressure, and then you have sometimes even pressure dissolution because of the intense pressure and temperature, where the grains are simply dissolved because of the pressure. So all of these things are termed as cataclasis, right? And that occurs when there is a lot of tectonic activity which happened at the crest near the Mangala bounding fault, right? So that is something that we wanted to look at. That is something that we wanted to, you know, check if that is affecting the performance of the well. Now, we looked at the different data points. We looked at the cutting descriptions first. That we saw that there was a lot of cement. Now, the cement is basically, you have the grains, and between the grains, you have deposits of iron, deposits like siderite, you have kaolinite, you have all of these clays, and you have these iron oxides that deposit, and they cement the pores. Because these things happen because there's a lot of hydrothermal fluid activity that is happening at the crest, at the fault near the MBF over here. So that is a lot of cementation that we expect. But based on the cutting descriptions in the wells over here, we did not find a lot of cementation. A little cementation, which is expected in a formation in a reservoir, but not to the extent that we expected because of this Mangala bounding fault over here. So basically, the conclusion was that the cementation and the matrix, the clayey matrix that we have, did not really have any effect on the production or injection over here. Another thing that we looked at in the cutting descriptions was rock flour traces. So rock flour is formed mainly because there's a lot of grinding, there's a lot of movement and grain breaking that occurs near these faults. I mean, it's such a large fault. You can imagine the amount of movement, the amount of tectonic activity that happened here. It's nearly a 2 kilometer throw. So that's a lot of movement that occurred along this fault, and because of that, a lot of the grains are basically powdered. They're so broken, they're so reworked that they're literally made into powder. So we saw a lot of rock flour traces, and those are the red points over here that we saw in these wells, right? So that indicates that there was a lot of cataclysmic deformation occurring at the fault, but it is not happening all across the fault. It is only restricted to this particular area in the field. Another thing that we saw was from the core data, that we saw that there was a reduction in porosity in some of the sands because of the increase in the kaolinite clay that was there near the fault over here. That was another thing that we saw. And lastly, there were no mud losses. So basically there is no channel that was created, there was no real conduit, there was no real place for the water to lose to go into the formation. So those were very minimal. So based on this, what we understood based on the data that we have, that there is cataclysmic deformation occurring at the crest, but not to the extent that the production or the injection is affected. Okay. So this was the thing that we looked at in terms of the properties of the reservoir, in terms of the log properties, the porosity, the permeability. This was one of the things that we looked at. So we looked at the distance, the position of the well from the MBF. We looked at log correlation and seeing if there are missing sections. We looked at core properties, log properties, to see if there is any effect of cataclysmic deformation in the properties in terms of porosity, permeability. And the last thing, there is another thing that we looked at, was the oil water contact. Just before I start this, is the previous thing clear? Is this clear to everyone?
Yes, sir, it's
Hello.
clear.
Yeah,
Hello, I have a question.
yeah.
Ideally, we keep the mud pressure higher than the formation pressure to evaluate the critical stress and to prevent any kind of blowout that occurs in a oil field. So, is there any particular range that you maintain in the field that this has to be the difference between the mud pressure and the formation pressure?
Okay, okay, good question. So it's not always higher than the formation pressure. Okay, so there is something called as the pore pressure. Basically, I am assuming you guys have an idea about the pore pressure that is there, right?
Yeah.
So in the reservoir below the ground surface, you have pore, right, which is filled with water or oil or gas, either one of the three fluids. So because of that, you have some kind of pressure that is being exerted by the formation. That is termed as the pore pressure, right? Now there is also a thing called the fracture pressure, right? So if we exceed that pressure, you're going to fracture the formation. That is the concept that you use in hydraulic fracturing. You intentionally go beyond that pressure to fracture the formation and to produce further, right? So there are these two major limits that we have. So we need to stay above the pore pressure, we need to stay above that formation fluid pressure, so that the fluids do not come into the well and out onto the surface. But we also need to be lower than the fracture pressure, because we do not want to fracture the well, fracture the formation, unless we are going for hydraulic fracturing. Right. So there are these two limits that are defined, and we keep the mud weight, the mud pressure between these two limits. Is that clear?
Yeah, so once it is, I mean, if you hypothetically, if you're simulating in the form of a reservoir modeling or something of that sort, then how much does it deviate in the real life situation? Is it too
So
much or
there's this thing. So between the pore pressure and the fracture pressure, there is a decent amount depending on the regime, depending on the tectonic activity, depending on the structure, depending on the fluids, a lot of other things. There is a difference. There is a marked difference between the pore pressure and the fracture pressure. That is actually called the mud window. Okay. As in when you go deeper into the earth, deeper into the formations, this mud window starts getting very narrow. It so there is a slight issue that happens when the mud window gets narrower, but just 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 imagine it as okay. One second, can I have this? Mm, Okay, no, I don't think that is there. Right. I'll just try and explain it because it would be very easy if I had a. Uh, okay, one second. I can just maybe turn on my camera and just explain this to you guys. Okay. Can you guys see me? Yep.
Yes.
Yep. Okay. So I'll just let me just give me some time to draw it. So if you see. Okay. Can you guys see this? Hello?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Okay.
yes,
So I'll just explain what I've drawn here. Now this over here is the depth. Sorry, this is the depth increasing below, right? Now this is the pore pressure also increasing with depth, and this is the fracture pressure. Okay. Now what we need to do is we need to stay within this limit. Okay, now this is actually defined, this pore pressure is actually defined based on various factors like your viscosity of your fluid, the porosity of your reservoir, the formation permeability, all of those things define how much this pore pressure that you have over here, sorry, I went behind. So this pore pressure, how it varies with depth, it is defined based on those properties. Now this fracture pressure is actually defined by the compressibility of the rock, the compressional strength, the Young's modulus, the Poisson's ratio, all of those things define your fracture pressure, right? So those are the things that we actually, based on our exploration wells, all of those things we actually define before we drill the well, right? We model those things. We model how the variation of the pore pressure and the fracture pressure is going to be, and we design the mud weight to be between those two pressures, right? And we need to keep varying it. So as you go deeper, so if you have a well which is only going to go till here, the mud weight does not need to change that much. But if we have to drill a well that goes all the way from here to here, the mud weight also needs to keep increasing continuously, right, to stay within that range. Does that answer your question? So
yes,
there is no set pressure, there is no set mud weight that we have. It needs to be defined based on the pore pressure and the fracture pressure, and we need to stay within that. If we go below the pore pressure, the fluids are going to come into the well, but if we go beyond the fracture pressure, we're going to fracture the formation, which is going to result in the mud basically going into the formation. Is that clear?
Yes, yes. Thank you so much.
Okay. So,
Hello.
yeah.
Sir, I have a question regarding this, sir. Sir, we have to keep pressure between the window of port pressure and fracture pressure, sir.
Sorry.
Sir, we have to keep the pressure of the well between
Mhm.
port pressure and fracture pressure.
Yes.
Yes, sir. Sir, if we have exactly the same pressure as port pressure, sir, port pressure will be same as the uh, port pressure, sir. Then, sir, there will be loss of fluid, no, sir, because we have to keep slightly increased bore well pressure as uh, 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 sir, we have to keep more pressure in bore as compared to sir port pressure, because sir, if it is actually exactly balanced, then sir there will be no formation of mud cake, and it is a mud cake which prevents which prevent
Yes. Yeah.
formation fluid which prevent formation fluid to get into the bore well. Sir, so we have to keep slightly increased pressure than port pressure.
Yes. So we need to be higher than the pore pressure, but lower than the fracture pressure. That's called the mud window. Okay.
Okay, sir.
Okay. So now going there, that answers that. Now the last thing that we looked at was the wells that are close to the oil water contact. So those were another set of wells, that these are the wells. Even though they do not have a missing section, what happened was, because they were so close to the oil water contact, this is the water leg, this is water leg. There is no oil saturation left over here. So they were so close to the oil water contact that even though we had the complete section, even though we had good sands in the well, that is the reason they were not producing, because they were so close to the oil water contact. So they were basically just simply producing water. Okay, so that was a minor thing that we also looked at later. And again, this we talked about the structural complexity due to the gravity collapse faults. Some places there were two gravity collapse faults, so there was an even further larger missing section, like how you see in well X and well Y. Look at the amount of sands that we have in this well, and look at the amount of sands we have in this well. Right, this has nearly 50 meters of missing section because it encounters two scoop faults, not just a single scoop fault. Okay, so that was another thing that we looked at. And lastly, then we came to the conclusion that two things mainly are affecting the well here. Firstly, that the distance from the MBF, that any well that is lying within 100 meters to 200 meters of the MBF is poor, is performing poor, mainly because of the cataclastic deformation that is occurring at the MBF, near the MBF in that particular region, and secondly the gravity collapse faults. So this bad performance is largely attributed to this gravity collapse faults, which is resulting in missing sections, which is showing in the terms of a missing sand unit in the particular wells, and the loss of connectivity with the rest of the reservoir. Okay, so that was the conclusion that we came up with. And what was the remedy? What was the things that we suggested to prevent this from happening? So what we did was, this is an existing well in the field, in the crest, which is encountering two different scoop faults, and there is only one big sand unit that we have in the well. So what we proposed was, we actually sidetrack it, we drill another well from the same well head, and we drill it away from the scoop fault, away from the MBF, so that we have a larger amount of sand that we encounter. So that basically would help in maintaining the connectivity with the reservoir, in helping the basically the well to get the support from the rest of the injectors in the field. That was the first thing that we suggested. The second thing that we suggested was actually to overcome the deformation that is occurring near these wells. So the deformation because of the MBF, because of the scoop fault that we have, we basically, what we suggested was, we drill through the well into the sands using a very high pressure jet, a water jet that we have. We drill through the sands, we basically cut through the deformation that is occurring in this particular region over here, and we access the rest of the reservoir. That was another thing that we suggested. And other suggestions that came up was, since this particular area in the crest over here was not getting injection support because of being isolated from the rest of the reservoir, we increased the injection in this particular area itself. Or later, another suggestion that came up was drilling new wells for, just to cater to this particular area. And another thing that came up right at the start, hydraulic fracturing. So what that would accomplish was increase the permeability, increase the porosity of the area, and that would help us produce a lot more than what we generally do now. So that came up as a suggestion, but because of the existence of this Mangla bounding fault, because of the safety issues that were happening, we could not drill those. We could not do that hydraulic fracturing in that particular area. So that was kind of rejected as one of the suggestions. That is it. And those that was all that is there in this kind in this
Uh,
kind.
Now, anyone have any question? You can ask.
So I have a very general question. It is not related to this. Can I?
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Sir, I want to just ask you how Vedanta is like doing the processes that is necessary to in order to revive back this doing this COVID. So what are the steps that they are doing, and what are the future steps that they are planning to do in order to like compete with the this battery environment also? So is Vedanta is very serious about that, or like what are the major things that they are doing? I just want to ask that.
To tackle the changes because of the COVID, right?
Yes.
Just a minute, just a minute. So, thankfully, what has happened here is that our fields are quite isolated in that sense. So, we did not have a huge issue right at the start because there were not a lot of infections, not a lot of cases that came. So, firstly, what has happened is we have stopped the movement to and fro from the field. That is the main thing that has stopped. We used to go on field, observe the wells, observe the plant over there, observe the cuttings, as I said, that we see. So we used to do all that, but we have stopped that. So that is the first precaution that we have taken. Uh, Apart from that, it has not really, the whole COVID pandemic that has happened has not really affected our work in that sense in a lot of ways. Apart from the fact that the people that are there on the field, their rotational durations, they have changed. Earlier, it was a 21 on, 21 day off thing. So they have, I don't know the exact number of days, but that has been increased a bit further so that the movement has been reduced. So that, if we increase the number of days to, let's say, 40 days and off, the number of times the person comes into contact with anyone outside the plant has changed, right? Has increased basically. So that is one thing that we have taken. That is one precaution that we have taken. Another thing is, if anyone does have to go on field, we have to get a test done. We need to have all of those basically permissions, approvals done before we head to the field. Apart from that, office life has not changed as much. The number of people that go to office has changed. I mean, there's a 30% strength that is there working from office. I go to office every Monday and Thursday, so that's like, not every day. But yeah, those are the few things that we have done to tackle that. Apart from that, there has not been a lot of major changes. There is definitely issues related to services and all our basically equipment that comes in. Those things have been affected, but because now it's been some time, we have had a nice process set up so that all of those things are checked. Everything, there's a nice safety check that happens, and there's a nice ample amount of time before the equipment actually reaches the field. So all of those things have been addressed. So there's not a real big issue. Yeah.
So, that means कि Vedanta or this K in India is not at all like majorly affected by this COVID.
It
You are saying
definitely
that.
has. It definitely has. I'm not saying like 100% no. It has been affected, definitely. I mean, everything has changed, right? I mean, like how if we have, let's say, a new well to be drilled, right? We need the services company. We have Halliburton, we have Baker Hughes, we have our own the drilling rigs that are supposed to come. I'm just giving an example here. That has stopped, right? The drilling has completely stopped. So that is one thing that is affected. We have a huge equipment of polymer that a huge shipment of polymer that comes to our field every month, every 2 months that comes. That has been affected because the transport chain has been affected. Those things have basically affected our production. That has definitely happened, but in the first few months it was a challenge because no one knew exactly when the lockdown would end, how this transport chains, how the supply chain would be resumed. Those things that had happened, that had affected our production. But now, since it's been nearly like what, March, so it's nearly been 6 months. So we have set up a nice process. If we need to order an equipment, if we need to order some polymer, anything, we order well in advance so that even though the transport chains, everything has been affected, that reaches us on time, right? So those things did affect us a lot earlier, but now because of relatively more normalcy in the operations, it's not affecting us as much now. Okay.
Right, right. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have some more general questions also.
Yeah.
Okay. So, can you please tell me whether in Cairn India Limited, geophysicists are much more preferred over geologists, or and what is the basic job of the geophysicist and the geologist the same, or is there any difference in their work?
Okay. So there is no actual preference in terms of geology. There's a equal amount of go.
Sir, your voice is breaking.
Sorry.
Sir, your voice is breaking.
Sorry.
Hello?
Hello. Yeah.
Yeah, sir, it's your voice was breaking.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir, now it's clear.
Yeah. So, what was actually what I was saying was there is no real difference in the number of geophysicists or the geologists like that. There is no real preference also in terms of actually. But the thing is that the work that we have, right? Considering that if you look at the depending on which field you're working in, like right now I'm working in a developed field, right? Which is currently producing. There is no real we have so many wells, we have so many well data points. There's not a real discovery that we're making. There's no real exploration or appraisal that is happening. So the work of the geologist or the geophysicist is slightly less compared to when it would be an exploration field or when it would be an appraisal field, right? In an exploration field, it's largely geologists and geophysicists that are working, right? Because the only data that we have is the seismic. The only data, if we have drilled a few wells, is the few exploration wells that we have. So there, the work of a geophysicist or of a geologist is a lot more compared to when it's a development field. When it's a development field, what has happened is we have multiple well points, multiple well data, pressure data is there, everything is there. So the focus is a lot more on production than actual geology, right? That is not to say that geologists and geophysicists don't have any work. The work that we do in the development field is more in terms of support to the production team. Basically, as I think you mentioned, the correlation, right? So how are the sands correlated? How can we basically drill a well over here and produce from a larger area All of those things are answered by geologists. The production guys are only in charge of the well once the well is drilled. Before that, where is the well going to be drilled? How many sands are you going to encounter in that? Is there any fault? Is there any kind of geological anomaly that we're going to look at when we drill the well? All of those things are basically looked at by geologists and geophysicists. Another thing that we do is we build models, right? We build static models. What we do is basically a representation of the subsurface. We build based on the well data points that we have. We populate a 3D grid, populate a 3D structure basically, and make properties, porosity, permeabilities. Uh, we define the sand and the shale in the model, and we give those to the dynamic model simulators, who then run it in with the production parameters that they have and see how it's going to produce. But the basic structure, the basic framework of the faults, of the well tops, of the well for horizons, all of those are given by the geologist. Right. So there is definitely a lot of work in the development field also, but it is a lot less compared to what a geologist or a geophysicist would be doing in a exploration or an appraisal field. Right. I hope that answers your question. A
Yeah.
geophysicist, to be specific, basically helps in understanding, mainly in terms of the model, how the faults are, how the fault structure is, how the horizons are basically. Every day there is a new data point that comes in. Every day there is a reprocessed seismic that comes back, right? So there is always an update that goes into the model. So the geophysicist looks at the fault. If there is a new fault that can be picked on the seismic, if there is basically an old fault that is not there in the new seismic, or maybe was because of an error in the old seismic, so that is updated. All of those things, that's what a geophysicist does. And again, we are very heavily involved in the production side. So if there is any particular well, right, and it has a very high water production, so a geophysicist and a geologist would look at that well in conjunction together, that if there is any particular fault in that well, if there is any particular fault in the seismic around that well, that is basically allowing the water to channel through the fault and into the well, and we are producing that water, right? So we are more heavily involved in that sense in the production. Okay, so that's a development geophysics physicist and a development geologist.
Yeah. So can I just phrase it this way? The geophysicists rather give the informations and the geologists interpret from those informations.
Uh, we both do the interpretation actually. Actually, in so let's say if we have a particular, let's talk in terms of these wells only, right? Which I just showed. So they were not producing well. They were not producing in at the rate at which we expected it to, right? Based on the properties that we had. So what we did was I didn't show it to you here because it would become a lot more complex. We had something called seismic variance maps. What we did was we actually mapped the amplitude in the seismic, and we made maps of those at different levels, and we checked how it was varying, right? If I can just show you that, I think I have that as a backup. Right. So this was a seismic variance map that we created. If you can see my screen, right? So what we did was we checked, the geophysicist here looked at the seismic. He or she basically here looked at how the sand and the shales are varying across the field, and the black and the white here. The black is where there is a lot of variation. So that indicates that there's a lot of faulting, there's a lot of activity that has happened. So the sands and the shales are very jumbled up, very mixed up in that area. Where the whites are, those areas are where there's relatively less tectonic activity, relatively less movement across. So it's a complete single sand or a single shale that is there. So that was one of the things that a geophysicist looked at when this was the problem that was put before us. What the geologists looked at was the log data, was the log correlations, was the fault that he can identify through the logs. Right. A geophysicist, on the other hand, was identifying the faults through the seismic variances, through the seismic, all of those things. So the data is there. The geophysicist looks at the seismic part of the data, interprets the seismic part of the data. The geologist looks at the log part of the data, right? And it's not just restricted. A geologist does look at the seismic, and a geophysicist does look at the log. It's quite intermingling like that. But that is the idea. So we have a problem, and we look at our two different points of data sets, whatever our expertise is, and we come up with a solution. We come up with an interpretation. Okay.
Okay, that's
Yep.
Anyone?
I have just another general question, sir. So just a last one.
Mhm.
How we are like obviously dealing with this all the energy departments are now looking towards this electric vehicles and energy transformation to electrics. So
Mhm.
how Vedanta is preparing for that in advance? Like what are the steps? Are there any carbon emission reduction that they are doing, or like what they are planning to do? I want to just know that.
So see, the thing about this is a very valid question. I mean, because renewables, electric cars are definitely coming. That is nothing to be uh, like. I mean, you can't avoid that. But the thing is that right now the infrastructure of the world in general is still more geared towards conventionals, right? Our electricity, I mean, how many, let's just take India for example. How many places have you actually seen a electric vehicle charging pump? Right. So the
No.
infrastructure for that is not there yet. Right. We still see petrol pumps a lot more often than electric charging points. Right. So that is definitely going to take some time. So right now, for at least another decade or two, we do not have, at least a decade, let's say, we there is going to be a slight and steady rise the in the electric vehicle, in the non-renewable aspect of the energy, but the conventional energy is still going strong. It's not gone down yet, right? So that is the first thing, that Vedanta as a company yet does not really have to look into that aspect uh, a lot more, right? There's still a lot of time, but again, we cannot completely avoid that fact. So we do have, I mean, in terms of I'm assuming that I do not know that, but I'm assuming we do have our investments, our you know what's the word? I'm not getting the word, but we do have our involvement in non-renewables as well. We are looking at other things. Uh, we have different, all our exploration blogs that we have. We have coal bed methane. We have um, what's that, gas hydrates, all of those things that we look at. We do not have the fields for that definitely, but we do look into it. So as a company, in terms of producing non-renewables, we do look at it. We do look at non-conventional side of the oil. Again, another thing that we do, the carbon emission that you mentioned. Well, we are an oil production company, so we try and reduce our emissions as much as we can. We our so our separation, our plant, basically the separation of sulfur, the separation of carbon dioxide, all of those are at a minimum as much as we can. But there is a limit that we can do it to. Also, again, the thing is, our plant is not really a refinery as such. It's just a separation plant. So there's a lot more gravity and physical processes rather than chemical processes involved in our this. So in terms of emissions, carbon emissions, we are relatively on the lower side, right? We are not a refining plant, right? We are more of a processing plant. So that is another aspect where we are low. So that kind of is the answer. I don't know much more about how we are trying to reduce the carbon emissions as such. But
That's fine. That's fine. Thank you.
yeah. And
Anyone else?
Acha. Could you please tell about your journey in Cairn? Because in 3 years you are in the post of senior geologist, and from the very beginning, what was your first task, rather, and then how the process went through?
okay, so I have actually been here for 4 years now. 2016, that's when I graduated. So the first year that we had was actually a complete training. Sorry. So what we had two different stints. So the first stint that I had was in the exploration department. That was for 6 months. I was there in the exploration department where it's basically it's a different thing. It's actually like a um, it's actually like a classroom environment where you're discussing ideas, where you're throwing up ideas, where you have a few data points, you're coming up with geological stories, you're coming up with geological solutions to fitting the data point, how uh, basically it must have happened, what was the depositional environment, all of those. That is the core of the exploration department, where you're trying to understand whether there is oil, if there is oil, how did it come there, all of those things. So that was the first 6 months of my company, of me in the company, in the exploration department. The next 6 months was actually in different development fields. So the first field that I actually worked in was in the Aishwarya field. So we have three major fields: the Mangala, Bhagyam, and Aishwarya fields. These are the three major fields that we have. The biggest ones, not just the major ones, the three biggest ones. I was actually doing petrophysics in the Aishwarya field, trying to understand the logs, how to, what is the basic physics behind the logs, like how does the gamma ray take readings, the resistivity logs, the neutron porosity, the density, other types of logs, the NMR logs. So that was the first few weeks of my stint in the development phase. Then I moved to another field where I was doing seismic correlations. Oh, in the exploration as well, we do seismic correlations and well correlations. It's just a basic part of that. Uh, then I did seismic correlations in the second field. That is actually a gas field that we have, Rageshwari. There was seismic. That's actually a volcanic field that we have. So that was there. Then basic correlations, well correlation, well log correlations that are there. Then moving on to building an actual static model using the seismic data, the well data that you have, building a full field model for Mangala. That was in the training phase. I built that static model. Then actually moving to a small tiny bit of production geology and drilling basically. So over there I was introduced to other production logs. So you have saturation logs, you have production injection logs, all of those things that are there. So those things we are introduced to. Then actually planning of wells, when you are actually trying to plan a well, how creating the trajectory, how we are going to drill it from, where you're going to drill it from. So you look at other wells that are there. You do not want to collide into that well, right? So you look at anti-collision issues, all of those. So that goes a whole thing into well planning, right? Drilling and well planning. So that was another short part of it. So that was my whole year, the first year, 2016 to 2017, where basically we were introduced to every little aspect of the whole exploration and production chain, right from the exploration phase where you do not have a single well. It's just a seismic data, that's it. Seismic data, gravity data, that's it, that's all you have, nothing else. To where you have a few wells that you come into the appraisal phase, where you have a few wells where you discuss, you understand how much oil is there, you give up a volume, then you discuss how you're going to produce, you define that plan, and then you move on to the development phase where you're actually producing. So how you're going to produce, that plan, how you're going to execute, how many wells you're going to drill, then you're building the model, you're looking at the petrophysics, all of that. So that was the first year. Then after the first year, I was assigned, and I am still in the Mangala field. That is actually the biggest field that we have in the company. It's about 1.3 billion stock tank barrels, 1329 million stock tank barrels, and we have produced around 400 million stock tank barrels. So that's like, less than 30% recovery, 35% recovery that we have. So I have been in that field for a long time, like nearly 3 years now. So it's been another new journey. The first year I was there, there was a there was a drilling campaign that was going on. So I was sort of in charge of preparing the the well plans, the well documents that go into actually, we are in a production sharing contract with the ONGC, right? So we need to give documents to ONGC, get their approval, all of that. So I was heavily involved in that. And then I moved to the second year. The second year was more involved in second and the third year rather. I have been more involved in actually increasing and improving the production. So there are a lot of maps that are made. There are a lot of correlations. There are a lot of saturation logs, production logs, all of those things. So that's been my third year, second and third year, and that's about it. Solving problems that basically come up, geological problems, geological solutions. That's been it. That's been my journey.
Thank you. That answers my question.
So, so I think no more questions. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Mr. Hawan Ahmed, who took out the time for this session and shared with us his vast experience and knowledge. Thank you, sir, and thank you to all of you for your participation. It was very nice and nice session. Now we formally end the session. Thank you. Thank you.
So if there's any question, whatever, Shiv has my number, has my email address as well. So you can just take it from him if you want. I'm completely open to answering anything else later.
Okay, and that is the great thing, sir. Thank you.
No problem. Okay, chalo.